What happens when we really know that something is going to end? Not vaguely, not someday, but with certainty. A date, a countdown, an ending written into the story from the beginning. Most of us spend our lives pretending we don't know how this all ends. And yet, every once in a while, something breaks through that illusion. Something reminds us that time is finite. And when that happens, we change. When we truly understand that something will end, we don't just think differently, we live differently. Welcome to Death Becomes Her, the podcast where we discuss death, dying, and grief from a variety of angles. I'm your host, LiElla Kelly. Today we're going to talk about two very different cultural phenomena. One from the internet, one from a video game. They reveal something profoundly human about how we behave when time becomes visible. On the surface, they have nothing to do with death in the way we usually think about it. But together, they tell a great deal about how we live when we know the ending is coming. On November 15th, 2019, creators Mark Fischbach and Ethan Nestor launched a YouTube channel with a built-in death sentence. It was called Unus, Annus, which is Latin for 1 year. From the very first video, they were explicit. This channel, like all of us, would only exist for a limited time. 1 video a day, every day, for exactly 1 year. And when that year ended, the entire channel would be erased. Every video, every comment, every trace, gone by design. Everyone knew this from the very beginning. This wasn't a surprise ending. It wasn't a plot twist. The ending was the entire premise. Now, the videos themselves weren't especially remarkable. Some were silly, some were strange, some were quiet, some were uncomfortable. They weren't educational. They weren't meant to be preserved. And that's important. The meaning didn't come from the content. It came from the container, from knowing that it wouldn't last. People knew they were dealing with something finite, and because of that, they showed up differently. They made time to watch. They paid attention. They felt a sense of presence that's rare in an online space. To understand this phenomenon, I took to Reddit and pored over a variety of Unus Annus themed threads. I wasn't there when it happened, so I had to pay attention to the people who were. Fans often describe Unus Annus not as something they watched, but as something they were a part of, a time-sensitive cultural moment. It's not uncommon for fans to say, you had to be there. The shared history, the inside jokes, even now, years after it ended, they still talk about it that way. One of the things that struck me most as I began reading reflections from the people who were part of Unus Annus wasn't the nostalgia, it was the behavior. People got tattoos, not subtle ones, really large tattoos, whole thighs, biceps, backs emblazoned with skulls and hourglasses, sometimes just the phrase memento mori. They created fan art, they made memes, they wrote songs, they treated merchandise like it was an heirloom. They grieved when those objects were damaged or lost. At first glance, it might be tempting to dismiss this behavior as excessive. We are talking about a YouTube channel, right? But when we slow down, when we really look, what we're seeing is something very familiar. When something meaningful is impermanent, we try to give it a body. We put it on our skin. We turn it into clothing. We make it something that we can touch. We memorialize it. This is not new behavior. It's a behavior repeated throughout human history. We have done this with locks of hair, with ashes, with jewelry, with saved voicemails and handwritten notes. The only thing that's different here is the source of the meaning. I came across a post from someone who wasn't writing about his grief over the end of Unus Annus, but rather his loss of a physical item. He explained that his partner had taken one of his Unus Annus shirts and cut it into a workout top. To her, it was just an old shirt. To him, it was so much more. It held a year, a community, a time in his life that had mattered. In his post, he wasn't asking the internet if his girlfriend was wrong, and he wasn't suggesting that his girlfriend should have understood the meaning of this particular t-shirt. He was asking if anyone else understood why this hurt. And that question, does anyone else understand why this hurts? That question comes up again and again in grief work. What he was experiencing wasn't the loss of an old shirt. It was a secondary loss. Not the original ending that had already happened and was expected. This was the loss of the memento. The loss of an object that carried memory. The loss of something that anchored a fleeting experience into the physical world. Secondary losses don't announce themselves. There's no ritual for them, no shared language, no clear permission to grieve around them. They're the losses that happen around the loss. The shirt, the voicemail, the photo, the object that held meaning when the thing itself was already gone. And because they're indirect, people can often feel embarrassed by how much it hurts to lose them. We tell ourselves things like, it's just a shirt, it's just a video, it's just a game. But what we're really grieving isn't the object, we're grieving the way it functioned as a bridge between then and now, between presence and absence. Secondary losses are often harder to explain and easier for others to dismiss. But their intensity doesn't mean something is wrong. It simply means we've lost another way of staying connected to something that has already ended. If you're listening and something about this feels familiar, I want to offer a question. Is there an object you're holding on to or missing, not because of what it is, but because of what it carries, what it meant to you? If so, there is nothing strange about that. That object was doing important work. And when something that holds meaning disappears, we grieve, even if we don't always have the words for it. What mattered wasn't whether the shirt could be replaced. It couldn't, and that was the whole point. What mattered was that he brought his grief to a place where it would be recognized. That Reddit thread didn't function like a comment section. It functioned like a grief circle, a place where people could say, yes, that makes sense. And when grief is witnessed, even grief that society doesn't formally sanction, it becomes survivable. And this is where we begin to see the pattern take shape. Something very similar happened in an entirely different space, one where the loss hadn't occurred yet, but was guaranteed. Enter Arthur Morgan. Arthur Morgan is the star of a video game called Red Dead Redemption 2. He is a character that someone created. He's an outlaw, a gunslinger, and a senior member of a crumbling gang in the dying days of the American frontier. He is not a clean hero. He is violent. He robs trains. He loots the dead. He threatens. He cheats. And at times he tortures. He survives by taking what he can from a world that is already leaving him behind. And yet, this is only part of who he is. Arthur is also reflective. He sketches birds and landscapes in his journal. He reads. He jokes with his friends, teases them, antagonizes them. He is fiercely loyal. He loves his horse. He confesses regret. He grieves. He notices the small, quiet things that most games rush past. Through campfire conversations, journal entries, and long rides through the open country, players come to know Arthur not as a symbol, but as a person. Flawed, weary, and slowly becoming aware that the world he built his life around is collapsing. In researching player experiences around Red Dead Redemption 2, I kept seeing the same moment described again and again. At some point, players realize something unavoidable. Arthur Morgan is going to die. You can't save him. You can't unlock a better ending. You can't outsmart the story. Once that truth lands, not just intellectually, but emotionally, something fascinating happens. They become less focused on running toward the end of the game. They slow down. They stop rushing the story. They spend time watching sunsets. They linger with their horse. They treat other characters with greater kindness. They stay longer in moments that don't advance the plot. They focus on relationships rather than outcomes. And when Arthur Morgan dies, people don't talk about it the way they would talk about finishing a game. They talk about it the way they talk about losing someone. Many describe sitting there after the screen fades to black, unable to move. Not because a story ended, but because a relationship did. And that makes sense. Arthur Morgan isn't just observed. Over dozens, sometimes hundreds of hours, players describe riding beside him, making choices through him, and inhabiting his moral uncertainty. You don't watch Arthur wrestle with regret. You practice it with him. One writer described their experience saying they hadn't lost a character, they lost a brother. The grief surprised them, heavier than many real-life goodbyes, not because it mattered more, but because it was participatory. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 don't just tell stories, they ask us to practice empathy. And when the end comes, the grief isn't borrowed, it's earned. Knowing the end didn't drain the meaning, it concentrated it. When the game ends, what lingers isn't spectacle or violence, but an image. A man on a horse, riding toward the sunset, not afraid, just finished. Arthur Morgan was fictional, but the void he left behind was real. And it tells us something important. Meaning doesn't require permanence, and grief doesn't require a body. What Unus, Annus, and Red Dead Redemption 2 reveal in very different ways is this. When we stop believing we can preserve something forever, we begin to inhabit it more fully. Impermanence doesn't cheapen meaning. It concentrates it. And whether we're talking about a YouTube channel, a video game character, or a human life, when the end is unavoidable, presence deepens, ritual emerges, and connections intensify. If you've ever found yourself grieving a story, a character, or a moment that wasn't real in the conventional sense, I want to gently offer this. What changed in you because you walked alongside that story? Not what you lost, but what you learned about yourself in the presence of an ending that you couldn't avoid or that you couldn't control. I ask you to reflect on this because sometimes the things that shape us most aren't the ones that last forever, but the ones that ask us to stay until the very end. Here's what these two stories have in common. In both cases, the ending was inevitable. The ending was known, and that knowledge changed behavior. People became more present, more intentional, more relational. When time stopped being infinite, it stopped being abstract, and suddenly the moments mattered. This is where I begin to recognize something very familiar, something that I see in my work all the time. When someone receives a terminal diagnosis, when a family understands that time is short, when the illusion of later falls away, people change. They stop postponing conversations. They stop sweating the small stuff. They become more honest, more tender, more here. The things that matter most aren't achievements or productivity. They're presence, connection, meaning. When death becomes visible, life becomes precise. One of the most interesting tensions around Unus Annus is that some people tried to preserve it, archiving, re-uploading, holding on. And I understand that impulse. Wanting to keep something we love is deeply human. But part of the power of Unus Annus was that it asked something harder of its audience. It asked them to let go. Not everything meaningful is meant to last forever. Some things are meant to be experienced fully and then released. That is true of people too. So here's the real question underneath all of this. What would change if we lived as though time were visible? If we could see the countdown clock like in Unus Annus? If we stopped assuming there would always be another chance, another conversation, another year, what would we savor? What would we stop postponing? Who would we show up for differently? Death doesn't make life smaller, it makes it honest. Unus Annus is gone. Arthur Morgan dies, and every one of us will too. The question isn't whether things will end. The question is how we choose to live, because they do end. Memento Mori. This has been Death Becomes Her. As always, remember, talking about death won't kill you. I promise. If you would like to follow me on the socials, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok. You can also find my website at www.leavingwellmt.com.